Hi everyone, FIDE Master Dennis Monokroussos here, and for the first time in a few months I think, we'll try to get caught up on the viewer games. So our first game is Saxby Jones, which was submitted by Lawrence, who is black, and he was especially interested in a kind of speculative middle game sacrifice idea that he had. And it is very, very interesting, and I think he thinks that it's probably sound. And it seems to me that it's sound as well. So let's take a look. He was black in this game, and let me flip the board around for everybody. Okay, so material is even at this point. It's obviously a game from King's Indian, or King's Indian-like in the opening, and I would say probably the best categorization, certainly of this kind of position, is King's Indian. And obviously black is amassing the forces for mischief on the king's side. Okay, well, in this position, no doubt both to kick the black rook away and also to prevent g3 from happening at some point, he chose g3. And now black played a very, very interesting move. So I definitely like this idea, and it even seems to be sound, so as a fringe benefit. So he plays the move bishop to e6. Okay, and actually before I say that it's sound, I mean, I should note that white doesn't have to take this. I think black should be okay if he doesn't, but maybe a move like bishop to c4, knight to d5 can be considered. Well, knight to d5, probably rook f7 is okay, but maybe bishop to c4 could be interesting, trying to get control over the light squares. So always bear that in mind. So I didn't really take a close look at that, but that's always something to think about, that of course sacrifices don't necessarily need to be accepted. Sometimes they do, but not always. Okay, well, white chose to play g takes f4. Black took back with the pawn, and black really has an awful lot going for him here. So let's kind of tally up the resources here. Now, a lot of players, I think Kasparov was maybe the first person to really emphasize this. That may be false, but he certainly did emphasize it, and I don't know if he used any special terms, but anyway, I'll get to the point, which is that, practically speaking, black has a material advantage in the position. How can that be? He's down a rook for a pawn. Well, he's attacking, and around the white king, there's really very little by way of defensive force. Excuse me. So the rook isn't really helping. The knight is a very good defender, or at least a very important defender. It's close to the area. The bishop's kind of helping, and maybe in some line the knight's going to help. But really you have this kind of barrier. So this pawn on f4 is kind of cutting the board here in half, and the e-file is just very hard for white to kind of come across. And meanwhile the action is going to take place on the h and g files. Okay, so let's look at all the attackers that black has. So there's the f-pawn, there's the g-pawn, there's the queen, there's this bishop. This rook from a8 can come into the game through f8 or g8. This bishop will come to e5, and or the knight coming to e5. So black really has far more pieces that can do damage. And you should count the pawns when you're tallying things up. Even if the pawns aren't going to deliver mate themselves, they first of all cover some important squares, and they take away squares from the opponent's pieces. So I think, even though it's a rook, I mean, it's a lot of material, it's a lot of stuff, black's chances are fantastic. Okay, in the game, white played knight to f5, which is a very reasonable move. Let's see what happens if he plays something like knight to g2. Actually, let me get rid of all of this stuff here. Okay, so if knight to g2, trying to cover up, and hoping for something like f3, and then sacrificing a piece back. So in a position like this, okay, black still has some hopes. I mean, this is far from over for white, the scare. But you know, he's at least bringing his pieces back. There's no longer that kind of barrier along the e-file that prevents white from bringing pieces to help out. So I wouldn't at all say that black is losing here, but it's, you know, at least white's better off than he should be. Okay, so I think the better move is bishop to e5. So bringing a new piece into the attack. Also, very important, preventing white from making some kind of liberating move like e5, which will give him the e4 square for the defense. In fact, maybe even here e5 could be considered, although white's giving up so much material by doing that then black is going to be attacking almost for free, and I'm sure it'll be catastrophic. Okay, so back to knight to g2. Bishop e5. So now f3 is an even bigger threat. Okay, white probably has to play f3. I mean, there's certainly nothing that's clearly better. Now g3. And clearly this pawn is a big bone in the throat. The obvious threat is to play queen h5 and queen h2. And even if the rook moves over, queen h1 can be mate. Okay, so rook f to b1, trying to clear as big a lane as possible. Now black has a very nice attacking idea. Bishop to d6. Okay, threatening bishop to c5 check. White should probably try to stop it with b4. And now what should black do? Well, the answer is that he should simply go on with what he was doing. Bishop to c5 check. And taking is just, it's nothing. Queen takes. If king f1, there's mate on f2. And on king h1, then we just check him and give mate. Okay, so after bishop to c5 check, king f1 is best. Now rook to d8. Another nice move. We'll see the point shortly. So on b takes c5, queen c5, again threatening mate on f2. King e1, queen g1 check. And now if knight f1, queen f2, and lo and behold, there's the rook on d8 doing its job. And on bishop to f1, there are a lot of ways to win. One very simple one is queen f2, queen f1 taking advantage of the pin, and then g2 taking advantage of two pins. So the knight can't take the queen. Well, the knight on d2 can't take the queen. The knight on e1 can't take the pawn. So black's going to make a second queen, and then we'll have, of course, a big material advantage. All right, so that's kind of a nice set of variations that shows that knight to g2 won't really solve the problem. So knight f5 is what was tried. Now here, knight to e5 is interesting, bringing another piece into the attack and also taking more control over f3. But maybe white's okay after something like rook f to d1, knight f3 check, and king f1. And I'm not sure that there's a win for black. I didn't look tremendously hard, but I did look a little bit. So knight h2 check, and here white should play king g1. And, okay, maybe there's some win. I mean, there's certainly promising continuations like bishop to e5. So I really wouldn't be surprised if there's some way to win. You just sacrifice pieces and bring enough into the game, and something good is bound to happen. But, okay, I mean, at the very least, there's a draw by perpetual. If white runs away, oh, I should say, when I say there's at least a draw by perpetual, it's actually important. When you're an attacker and you sacrificed quite a bit of material, it's always good to see that there are these little bailout lines. So you know that you at least have a draw in hand, and it gives you freedom to look for more risky, or I should say more ambitious continuations, knowing that you're at least safe. Okay, so if king to e1, then g3, and if knight f3, g takes f2, rook to d8, and now, funny enough, black can just swap some things because he's got that powerful f-pawn. So for instance, this position, black is still technically down. He's down the exchange for a pawn, but black is playing without, or white's playing without the rook on a1. Black's king is safe, while white's king is in plenty of trouble. The knight on e5 is beautiful. The bishop on e6 is very good. Anyway, white's lost here. Okay, so that was knight to e5, but our viewer played bishop to e5, which is also quite good. And again, f3 stuff is hanging over white's king, and I think white's lost. So he played rook f to d1, trying to make room to run, and also giving his pieces the f1 square, the bishop or the knight, to help defend. If he tries bishop to c4, it's a reasonable idea, trying to get rid of one of the attackers, but it lets black keep up the pace of the attack. So take the knight and then play f3. And black has lethal threats here. So he's threatening bishop to, well, okay, from here he's threatening queen to h4, of course, or queen to f4. But he's also got bishop to h2 check, and so he can do it with checks, at least till here, and then play queen h3, and then there's no defense to queen g2 mate. I mean, you can play knight f3, then gf3, and queen g2 mate is still coming. So in this position, probably rook f to e1 is the best move. Bishop f4, attacking the knight. And if queen to e4 takes, rook e to d1, we just come back, and now g3. And white's getting killed still. As you can see, all these black pieces just flooding into the attack. And now black is up a piece. And I mean, you can play king to d3, but then there's rook to e3 check. So it's a lost position for white. So after bishop to e5, again, white played rook f to d1. Again, takes. Very good, because the knight is a good defender. I mean, it can come back to g3 if the f-pawn moves up. And black's light-squared bishop rarely is going to have a chance to directly participate in the attack. So by exchanging off white's best piece, it's performing a very valuable function. So bishop f5, ef5, f3, and white's lost. What can he do? If he tries knight to f1, hoping to use the knight in the same way that the other knight could have, by going to g3, well, queen h4 is winning. And the problem is that queen h3, g2 mate is a threat. If white plays knight to e3 to stop that, then it's queen h2, queen h1 again. And if knight to g3, then bishop takes g3 is winning gobs of material. Okay, if knight e4, same thing. Queen h4, threatening queen h2, queen h1 is decisive. Okay, another try is knight to c4. But what's the win for black? Do you see it? Bishop h2 check. And after king h2, g3 check is very nice. Okay, let's look at the options here. If king to g1, then we can just take and check. If king e1, rook e8 is winning, so king e3 tries to give the king some kind of some semblance of freedom out on f4 and safety, but okay, just f takes e2, and the attack goes on, the pawn is dangerous, and white's lost. Okay, so after g3 check, f takes g3, but now rook to g8 is a killer. There's no defense to queen takes g3, followed by mate on g2 or h3 or somewhere like that, except to play rook to g1, but then there's queen h5 mate. So in the game, white was no doubt pleased by all of these wonderful options and chose king f1. So very sensible, getting out of the way and hoping perhaps to at least get rid of the f-pawn after the exchange. And black did in fact take, but maybe even better is queen to h5, keeping all the threats in store, and also allowing, after knight takes f3, g takes f3, and there's still going to be a pawn on f3. So here I think black is clearly winning. Well, he's winning after f takes e2 also, but he makes a couple of mistakes later on. So rook e8 is good, queen e4, and now black's move is very well motivated. He plays rook to e7, so that way his rook's protected, so he can move the bishop. But probably even better was queen to h5. So this protects the rook, and of course thereby enables discoveries, but it also makes g3 possible too. So it adds some threats to the position. And if white tries to play king f1, then there can be queen h3 possibilities. Okay, or at least not necessarily right away, but queen h3 and queen h1 may quickly arise after some bishop move, and the queen clears town. So okay, played rook to e7, and now here king to f1 would have been best. After bishop takes e3, then queen to d5. Black's still definitely better, but white's at least avoided the worst, or at least avoided immediate death. I mean, black still has to prove the win again. Okay, instead white played queen to d3, and here bishop f4 check would have been best. In the game, played bishop to d6 check. Okay, again white should play king f1, but black is still much better. Anyway, white played knight to e4, queen takes f5, and here it's lost, and black finished convincingly. Finished white off convincingly. So here, rook f1, knight e5, so using all of the pieces, good attacking technique. And after queen c2, final simple tactic, but more than good enough, forces mate, rook to e2 check. And white resigned because After rook e2, king e2, queen c3, or queen c2, sorry, king e1, knight f3 is mate. And after king e3, there's got to be a quick mate here. Looks like this works. Queen to d3, king f4, and queen f3. So very nice attacking game and a terrific idea, sacrificing the rook. I think it's absolutely sound and very nice. So good job. Okay, let's take a look at the next game now. Actually, I'm going to skip over this one. It had its interesting moments, but a lot of tactical errors. So I'm going to skip that and go to the game Cavaterra against Luciarelli from the Festival International, or International Festival for Kaisa in sometime in October, I think, of 2009. Anyway, the point is, we get to this ending. It was submitted by Black. Kyoto is his handle on our server, and here he came up with some very, very long plan. So here's what he says. He says, quote, "I'm slightly bitter, but I don't see a way for Black to continue with queens on the board. For example, I cannot mobilize my pawn majority, or it is risky. Also, White's plan is to advance his queenside pawns and create a passed pawn. Except for the a1 rook, White's queen and rook are well placed to support the c-pawn's advance, and later the a1 rook can activate through the b-file. If I let this happen with queens on the board, White will have plenty of play, tying my pieces to defend from promotion, while White can possibly attack elsewhere, maybe the king. If I exchange queens, I will make things more concrete, reducing White's options to just creating a passed pawn. Here's my plan. Block the c-pawn from advancing with the rook, probably with the pawn on c6. At first it will appear a little passive, but then comes the key difference. I can activate my king easily, while White has problems in doing so. I thought I could win the c-pawn in this way, active king plus active rook on the d-file and blocking rook on the c-file, versus active rook on b-file plus protecting rook on c-file plus passive king. It is important to leave Black's pawn on a7 so that b6 is taboo for White rook to support the c6 pawn. This was my plan, starting from move 27, which is right now, queen takes c2. Around 12 moves later, move 39, rook to e8 check, I realized that I cannot capture the pawn because the black king can always be checked while trying to reach d6, or I could capture the pawn but lose the a7 pawn, which could be quite dangerous, even though my rook could come to the c2 square and eventually to a2, controlling the a pawn from behind and cutting off the king. So I began thinking of a similar but better plan. Infiltrate my king on White's king side after some checks, or not, then capture the c6 pawn, which cannot be defended anymore because of White's rook on the 8th rank, okay, and so on. And that's close to the end, and then he talks about some mistakes later on. So he asks finally, was the queen exchange a good idea together with the two-step plan I had in mind? Okay, it's maybe the only plan available, but I liked how I saw it first. I might look passive and slightly worse, but later could activate the king more. Okay, and if not, what might have been a good plan with the queens on the board? Okay, now that's quite a mouthful, obviously, but I think it's kind of interesting, and I think it's both good and maybe slightly suspicious. Okay, so I think actually it's great to try to think schematically like that. I mean, that's a terrific way to approach endings, and if you have time to think so deeply, that's really excellent. On the other hand, you may want to be a little more flexible in the sense that it's often very, very difficult to predict a plan that far ahead. And as you noted yourself, around 10, 12 moves later, you realize that part of the plan wouldn't work. And I would say, especially in an endgame where there are such active pieces like rooks, you always have to be kind of careful about that. So it's difficult whenever your opponent has active possibilities to really plan things out so completely. But I think it's pretty decent reasoning, although I would say that while you're right that it's difficult to activate your entire majority, if you keep the queens on and play for just e3, I think that could do a pretty fair amount of damage by itself. So I think on the one hand, your plan leads to an endgame, a rook ending, where you're probably a little bit better. So not a lot, but maybe a touch better, although I really think that White should draw. In fact, in the game, White did draw, but it was after an exchange of errors. But generally, the trend was towards a draw. On the other hand, though, if you play e3 with the queen still on the board, if you can make this happen, and at least it looks reasonably likely that you can, then I think you can have much more. You can have more winning chances. Another thing is that your queen is very well centralized. So if you drop back to d4, and even if it has to go back to e5, I think that's all to the good for you as well. So I don't know that promises objectively a bigger advantage than the endgame plan, but I think it's more dangerous for white. I don't think you have any danger in either case, but I think there are more troubles for white with the queens on the board. Okay, well let's take a look. So queen c2, rook c2, rook d3, activating the rook. g3 is logical. Rook e to d8, and here comes white's idea. c5 takes, rook c8. Okay, and all right. So now we'll look at a number of places where white can do something else. Although again, pretty much everything that white does is good enough. So in the game he plays a4. He wants to keep the pawn safe, but I think he can even just push. So c6, say king f8, rook to b1, rook a3, rook b4. Okay, and this is an idea we'll see again. So trying to induce the f pawn to come up to defend it, and now switch gears with rook to b7. So hitting the h pawn and cutting off black's king. So for instance, rook a6, takes, and this is just a dead draw. So I think that idea of encouraging the black f-pawn to move up and then taking advantage of the very weak 7th rank, well, it's very weak for black, very good for white. I think white can achieve a draw pretty easily in that way. But a4 is fine. Okay, king f8, rook to b1, rook c7, as advertised. And now an idea I think that's not bad is rook check, rook h8, and rook c4. So once again, the exact same idea. We're going to induce this pawn to move up, and then check, and he's fine. Rook to g8. Okay, if rook c6, then rook to b4, or rook to g7 check, and rook takes a7, maybe even better. So black can try the kind of cute rook to d6, but this is also going to be a draw. So black at least gets the passed a pawn, but white will have a passed h pawn, and this should be a draw as well. Okay, black played c6, king e7, and now the contours of white's idea, or of black's idea, excuse me, are starting to take shape here. Okay, again, this is still possible though. Rook c4, f5, rook to b8, but black's king has gotten a bit further into the game, so it's not as good now. Okay, so rook to b8. Here, I think black made an inaccuracy. Played rook to d8, but I think he could have played more actively maybe with rook to d4. Okay, so a5, rook a4, rook e2, f5, f3. So again, going for counterplay, but okay, takes, and I think about this position that black has some chances now. I don't know if it's a win, but I don't think it's overly fun for white anymore. I think, well, obviously black is better, but I suspect even that black's winning chances are better than white's drawing chances at this point. Okay, so rook to d8 was sensible. Okay, and now rook to b4. Finally, this plan goes into action. Okay, white played king f1. I think you can also play king g2 and then f3. And after this liquidation, this is just a draw. Alright, so king f1 happened, rook to d3, rook b8, going active, good idea. Okay, check. Now here, kind of a funny move. You could play f4 and drive the king back. Now, black has a passed e-pawn, but it's not going to survive. We're just going to take, and this is a draw. Okay, black is a tiny bit better because white's a-pawn is slightly vulnerable, but I believe that this should be a draw. Okay. Yeah, so let's go back to the game. Rook e8 check. Check, check, check. Okay, and now, I think, having driven the king all the way across the world, white should play rook to b8 with the idea of rook to b7. So I think this would have been a good plan. So instead, king to g2, which is a little bit irrelevant here, really. Black played rook to d6, rook a8, h5, and now definitely, okay, h4. And this is just a good idea in general in structures like this. So you want to have, when you've got the minority side, in a rook ending. So rook and 4 versus rook and 3. This is the best pawn formation almost always. And one major reason why this is the case is that it becomes extremely difficult for black to make a passed pawn without swapping off all the pawns. And if he has to swap off all the pawns and you get to rook and 1 versus rook and 0, as long as the defender's king is in front of the remaining pawn, it's a very, very easy draw. I mean, it's elementary. So h4 I think is great, and of course the big point is that king to g4 can be catastrophic. I mean, the king can get in all kinds of danger. Things like rook c4 threatening f3, or rook to g8 with ideas of rook takes g6. I mean, black is tied down the rest of the game to defending against those threats. Okay, so a5 doesn't throw away the game by any means. And again, this should just be a dead draw. So rook c2, and now h4 check, because again it drives the king back, because here rook a6 and black is mated, or has to throw away the rook with rook takes f2 check. So king f1 is a big step in the wrong direction here. So he's getting out of the threat of e3, but now e3 comes anyway, and at this point white's pawn structure is compromised. So he's still drawing, but it's much worse. So fe3, rook h2, and now, okay, white should just wait here with a move like rook to a6 or rook to a8. Basically, leave the king where it is because it covers both the g and, or prevents black from attacking the g and e pawns in a meaningful way, and leave the pawn on a5 so that way, if black plays king to g4, again we can counterattack with rook to g7. So a6 is a mistake, a little bit of a mistake. Rook a2, but now comes the real mistake. So here I have to tell the player who submitted this, don't be too reliant on the computer evaluation. So yeah, after a6, the computer will jump from roughly equal to black being a pawn better. But in fact, if you study rook endings a bit, you'll see that 3 on 2 is often a draw, and even here with the split pawns, it should be a draw as well. The point would be after rook to b7. Actually, maybe that's not quite right, because one very interesting idea. So this might be a fly in the ointment. After rook to b7, maybe king to g4 is the best move. So let's see the natural line. Rook takes a6, king f2, and now it's a draw, because if king to g4, rook b4 check drives the king back, and otherwise the king's going to come to f3, and there's nothing for black to do. So if he plays rook a3, big deal. We just play rook to b6, white should hold it. Or if rook a6, and the idea is to protect this pawn so that black can play h4 and at least create a passed g pawn. But this doesn't win, so we'll allow it. King f2, h4, takes, king f3. Let's say rook a8, because you can't play g5 here on account of rook h7 mate. Sorry, it's not mate, it's mate next move. Okay, so rook a8, but we just check him away. We take the h-file, and even if we give him the h-file, play king g3. There's just no way for black to win this. This should be a draw. Okay, I shouldn't make it sound that simple. I mean, black can definitely push and slowly push the g pawn, and I would play this out and feel some optimism if I played a lower enough rated player. But objectively, this should be a draw, and it's a good idea to maybe practice such endgames against your computer. But anyway, going back to this position here after rook to b7, which is definitely better than rook to a8, it may be though that king to g4 is going to give black some very good winning chances. Okay, but well, let me see. Maybe it's going to be the same thing. Okay, rook to b6, and now, okay, not g5, but king f3. Yeah, this looks like big trouble. Maybe what can we do? Maybe king g1. Okay, and now g5. Yeah, this does not look fantastic. Okay, one last try maybe. Rook to b5. Takes. Okay, yeah, this is okay. All right, maybe this is an idea. H4, and the point is on takes. Then this. No, but okay, at some point you've got to play king takes G3. Okay. Yeah, no, this isn't going to work. Anyway, the idea is, of course, king G3, rook G5, and this is a dead draw. So maybe this still holds. All right. I mean, I want to find some way of making an umbrella here. Okay, well, anyway, so back to the original. So king G3, rook F5, G4. Okay, what should white do? Can't take on H5, of course. And if king F1, H4. Yeah, okay, so I don't know what I was confusing myself about here. This is looking like a win for black. Certainly much better for black. Yeah, so okay. So this I think is pretty interesting. So king G4, and maybe there's some draw, but it's not simple. All right, another idea. Let's play rook to G7. This looks maybe more logical, but rook takes A6 then. What else? Yeah, okay. So black is definitely black definitely has some chances. Okay. Well, anyway, rook to A8 makes it easy. King to G4, A7, and here black played G5, which is a blunder. The thing is, okay, it's just that it's completely irrelevant to what's going on. So the move here is king F3. So we threaten mate, and by we're going to drive the white king to some bad square and play G5, G4, and king G3 and simply win. So G5 is well motivated, but surprisingly, perhaps after king to E1, there's nothing for black to do, because after king to takes G3, rook to G8, and the threat of queening forces rook A7. We can give check on A1, but that does nothing. King E2 then, and now this, and the pawns disappear. I mean, you can play king H4 and keep the H pawn, but it won't even come close to winning. So everything liquidated. And rook to E5 check is a nice, accurate last move, not letting himself get mated, and he'll take on H5 next move. Okay, so a very interesting rook ending, and again, I definitely want to commend black for trying to think in this long-range schematic way. But again, you know, a little cautionary note that rarely will such long plans work in a position where the opponent has any activity at all. Okay, next game. So this is, okay, I'll just talk about the opening in this one. So this is from Krumov, and he was black in this game and tried the Paulson. And yeah, so he says that the opening stage was not so good, but I'm going to more or less restrict my comments to the opening stage. Well, opening to early middle game. And I think there's something instructive to be said about this. Okay, so there's the Paulson, or the Khan Sicilian. C4, knight C6, knight C3, bishop to B4, A3. Okay, so this I think is a bit dubious, and black should carry out the threat. I mean, the point of playing bishop to B4 is that there's not only just a pin, but to make a threat to ruin white's pawn structure, and black should take white up on the offer. And okay, in this position, I wouldn't say that black is better, but certainly he's achieved full equality. Okay, after bishop to A5, though, now the bishop is going to be kicked away into a worse square. So white has a few things that are good to play. It could play knight takes C6, and on BC play queen D4 and bishop B3, and I think white's just clearly better here. The bishop on C8 is bad. White has more space, and black really has nothing to compensate for white's advantages. Okay, but white's choice was pretty good too. So B4, but now B5 is a poor move. Okay, there's no reason for this. And think about it. I mean, you know, white's pawns here are very nice because they're covering all of these squares. So D5, C5, B5, A5. Okay, everyone's covered here, and it takes away pretty much, you know, almost the entire fourth rank from black. Okay, you can see that this square is covered too. H5 is covered. G5 is covered. So only e5 is really there for black's use. But by playing b5, okay, now all of a sudden, yuck, c5 is available, a5 is available. Well, all these juicy dark squares for this bishop and for the queen even, maybe too. So knight d4, queen d4, and then here black should immediately take the fight for these dark squares. So instead of knight f6, which invites e5 and the knight just goes back to the starting point, instead queen f6 is very good for a couple of reasons. So one is it of course kills all of these white threats. It stops e5. And because white has now weakened himself on the dark squares, it's a good idea in general for black to swap off dark squared pieces. Well, white's dark squared pieces. There's also a nice little threat of bishop to e5, which is a nice feature as well. So black would be better here. Okay, after knight f6, e5, knight g8. Probably best is bishop to d3, developing the bishop to an active square. Why not? So instead, bishop to e2, which isn't bad, but not best. Knight to e7, and here white continued on the path to positional suicide with g4. So on the one hand, it's very understandable. Okay, he doesn't like the idea of knight to f5. So that's, as I said, that's quite understandable. Of course, it's also a reason why bishop to d3 would have been better. But the old phrase about the cure being worse than the disease is certainly true here. So something like bishop to g5 would have been a lot better. Develop a piece. You prevent knight to f5 because white will get a 3 for 2 on knight to f5. So knight f5, takes, check here, takes, and black is completely lost here. Not only down material, but with a horrible position to boot. And the bishop on c8 is a joke, and the rook on a8 is never going to come into the game either. I mean, it would really be great if white continues with b6 and bishop to d6, something like that, and the queenside pieces are retired forever. Okay, so g4 really bad. Again, creating more dark square weaknesses. So knight to g6, of course, aiming at this, and now h4 becomes weak too. f4 can become weak. All right, white played f4, d6, a pretty good move. Not forced, but it's good. And it has a nice little cheapo, which white didn't fall for. The cheapo is ed, bishop d6, queen takes g7, and now bishop f8, and the queen is trapped. In the game, though, white played queen to e3, but after d takes e5, black simply up a pawn with a huge advantage, and not surprisingly went on to win the game. Okay, now the moral of the story, or one of the morals of the story that I wanted to bring up, was about studying openings a lot. So you take a look at this game. Okay, white played pretty weakly, but I think again it shows that, especially lower club levels, it's not so important to really know openings as it is to have a good understanding of how to develop pieces. So if the player who had white in this game is watching, what I would say is to go over a lot of Grandmaster games. Get a book on, let's say, Fischer's games, like the new book that came out from Karsten Mueller, a great book, or a book of Karpov's games. Some good positional player, but any Grandmaster really, or just go through the databases and play through a lot of their games, even kind of quickly. And just by doing that, you'll see what good opening play looks like in practice. Because, okay, even if you don't know opening theory, I mean, it looks like white actually knew a little bit of opening theory, but his play was just positionally really bad. And that's just what happens when you quote-unquote study the openings, but don't really understand how to play in an opening. I mean, a move like b5 is horrible, weakening all kinds of squares. And g4 as well. I mean, it's just really catastrophic. Okay, it's not quite catastrophically bad, but it's a serious positional error. And white has made all of these terribly weak points in his position. So studying the openings becomes more important as you get stronger. But really what's important is to understand structures, understand how to develop pieces in a coherent and logical way, and not to create a lot of weaknesses. And again, weaknesses are generally generated by excessive pawn moves. Okay, on to the next and I believe last game in our current batch. Okay, for once I think white got to be the hero. So let's flip things around here. And okay, so it goes through the moves kind of quickly. So we have a Pierce, and not an overly accurately played one by either side as far as the opening is played, but not horribly bad either. Okay, so we get to this position, and alright, here black played e6. And okay, I don't like this move that much, but it's not so horrible. But a couple of reasons why I don't like it. First of all, there's not really any need for it. Okay, so he's trying to stop f5, and that's okay, but the thing is, if white plays f5, there's no real threat, and he's undermining this excellent knight on e5. So the question is, well, why would you want to play f5 if you're white? Okay. But ironically, white does go for f5 in the game, and it works out, but not because of its own intrinsic merits. Alright, so what would I play instead for black? Well, I play b4. So I'm going to kick this knight away, and then d5 and e4 become squares that I can use if I'm black. Additionally, at some point I'm going to want to try to play c5, both to liberate my own pieces, but also to undermine this knight on e5, and to do it before white plays bishop to f3 and locks in my bishop and pressures this pawn. Okay, so e6, bishop f3. It's a good move. Queen c7 is also a good move, protecting the pawn and the bishop on b7. Okay, and now white goes a little crazy here with g4. It's actually not too dangerous yet because the center isn't going to open up too quickly, and white has the bishop on f3, so he's not really going to be too weak on the diagonal, at least not yet. Okay, now here black played knight to b6. I think just the immediate knight to d5 is quite good as well, both in its own right and also as prophylaxis against f5, because then knight takes e5 is quite good. But knight b6 is alright. f5. Okay, and now some interesting possibilities here. Okay, in the game, black played e takes f5. Oh, there was something that I wanted to say earlier. Sorry about this. Back to f4. Another thing I don't like about e6 is not just that it's not really consequential and unnecessary, but that it weakens d6 and f6. So this becomes weak and this. And generally speaking, when you fianchettoed, or I would just say in general, whatever you do with this bishop, okay, it's often a bad idea to push both here and here, because okay, the bishop can only control one diagonal or the other. It can't control both a3, f8, and okay, and this guy too. Or even this one, unless it's back on f8, but then why play e6 and g6? So the point is, after e6 and g6, there are weaknesses, and f6 is also weakened a bit. So that encourages things like g4, f5, g5, f5, stuff like that. Alright, so back to the game. After f5, one possibility is knight f to d7. So trying to undermine and exchange away this knight on e5, the strong knight. Now here, one very interesting way for white to play is with bishop to h6, just going full board for the attack. Knight takes e5, and now bishop takes g7 is very interesting. So see if you can figure out why knight takes f3 check is not good at all for black. And even for extra credit, figure out, well, why does it matter? Why isn't it any worse than just taking the bishop on g7 straight away? Okay, well here's the answer. Okay, on knight f3, rook f3. If black doesn't take the bishop, he's in terrible shape. But if he does, he's getting mated. f6, king h8, queen h6, threatening mate on g7. And here, a stock pattern. Although just rook to h3 is more than good enough. But even simpler is just to take right away and play rook h3 mate. So an elementary pattern, but one you got to know. So the difference here is after king takes g7, if f6 check, well, there are two differences. So first of all, there's no rook on f3 ready to come to h3. And second, incredibly, black can even just take the pawn. So if bishop takes c6, for instance, just king to g7, no harm. And without a pawn on f6, the black king is really pretty safe. So takes, de, and now b4, and in fact, black is much better. So material is even, but white has a lot of weak pawns, and weaknesses in general. So better after king f6 is d takes e5, but king g7, and black is clearly better, again because white's attack is really kind of dying, if not already dead, and again there's weaknesses on e5 and elsewhere. Okay, so after king g7, probably best is d takes e5, but here black seems to be okay. And white certainly still has some prospects, but black is really pretty solid. White's not going to be able to bring the queen of g7 to give mate anytime soon, and with a wide open center, I think black has very good chances. So after f5, knight f to d7 would be my recommendation. Okay, after e takes f5, bishop f4. Again, a kind of a brave move, but f takes g4. So just as king takes f6 was kind of fearless in the other variation, here black shouldn't worry about the discovery on the queen, because after knight takes g6, queen d8, what does white do? It's got two minor pieces under attack, and after knight f8, gf3, the knight on f8 is trapped, and there's not really any attack from white to speak of, so black is winning here. So after f takes g4, knight c6 is best. Queen d7, knight e5, queen c8, and material is even, but you can see that white has no attack at all, and black is doing great. Okay, so in the game, black played queen to c8, and from here, I think white played generally pretty well. Well, it's not that white played badly before, but if black had defended without being, let's say, overly afraid, then I think he could have had an advantage. So now, after g takes f5, black is definitely worse. Okay, now after this, white's best would have been bishop to h6. Not bothering with knight takes d5. Oops. See, the thing with knight takes d5 is that after c takes d5, I think black is okay. So he's threatening to take on f5. He has at least some possibilities of play or pressure on the c-file. Knight to e4 might occur at some point. So black has at least some trumps here. So after knight b to d5, I think best is bishop to h6. Also preventing queen takes f5 because of discoveries. Bishop takes d5. So knight c3, takes, bc3. Again, queen f5 is no good because of bishop takes c6. So let's say queen c7, rook a to e1, rook a to e8, and queen f4. And material is even, but white has maintained very good control over the center. The center has stayed stable. He doesn't have these light squared weaknesses, and he just has a nice position. So white is definitely for choice here. Alright, so after knight takes d5, black played knight d5, which is okay, but cd I think is even better. Bishop d5, cd5, bishop h6, f6, takes, knight g4, g5, h4. And white definitely has a very dangerous attack and has the momentum here, but black could still survive with, again, a bold move, h5. And the point is that he needs to fight for these squares here while he can. So white could play the sacrifice that he does in the game with knight f6, but I think he can survive by running the king over to the queen side. So it's black might even be better here. So maybe there's some improvement for white along the way, but it looks as if black can just take the long route to safety. Well, in the game he played queen to c7, and now he's got some troubles. Actually here, funny enough, okay, white played a very logical move, rook to f3. So he stops queen to g3 check, and he prepares to bring the rook to h3 in some positions, or to double rooks, or maybe to play rook to g3 if the black queen leaves the diagonal. But despite all of this, it actually was best, I think, to play h takes g5. Because after queen g3 in this exchange, we get to a position where material is even, and black has the two connected passed pawns on the king side, but the f6 pawn is more important, and the black bishop on b7 is just a terrible, terrible piece. It's doing absolutely nothing. And white will follow up with knight to e5 check, and or rook a to e1, and playing rook to e7. So white has a nice advantage here. Okay, after rook f3, the game continued to h6, and this is probably a mistake. So, okay, maybe there's some improvements for black along the way, but from here, white finishes off in style. Takes, takes, takes again, and queen h6. And this is a very difficult position for black to hold. So he plays some accurate moves. Here, black played queen takes c2 and lost. Well, we'll take a look at how this goes. So check, check, and essentially what white's going to do is force the black king at some point to go to a file where a rook can check, and that'll be the end. Okay, so in time pressure, he played this, repeated once, but now rook to e1. And here it's just target practice, many ways to win. And that was one of them, more than good enough. Black resigned here. Okay, so in this position, black's best try is probably rook a to e8. And it's not easy for white to win here, but I think he does with the kind of paradoxical rook to e1 check. So he allows black to just swap off this rook, but the same basic idea we looked at before is going to win. Queen h7, if king f8, queen to e7 is mate. Well, king takes f6 loses the rook, but this general idea of, again, forcing the black king ultimately to the e file or the g file, allowing white's rook to come into the action, will decide. One interesting line. Rook to g2. Check. Check again. Check again. And there we go. Okay, actually it's not yet. Still not over yet. So we have this f6 idea. And now the threat's queen to e7, followed by f7 and f8 queen. And there's not really any good answer to this threat. So black can try some checks here, but now he's just down a rook, and if he takes, it's mate in two. So anyway, long variation, and of course not to be foreseen, at least not without a lot of time. But I think white's attacking play was really excellent, especially for the player's rating. So the guy's 1790 was the rating that he gives in the game data. So really a very nice game, very well played, and again very, very logical. So the only thing I would maybe caution him about is that a move like f5, if you're black, or again if you're facing this, you should always consider things like this where black doesn't panic but tries to eliminate this active piece here and commits himself as little as he can on the king side. And even before that, again, e6 I think is rather bad. And so g4, I think g4 and f5 is positionally at least quite dangerous, but you know, here it's kind of a judgment call. I mean, I think objectively maybe it's slightly inferior, but the center is relatively stable. So that's, you know, the rule of thumb. If your opponent attacks on the flank, you counterattack in the center. And conversely, of course, or the corollary would be that if the center is open, then you should be pretty careful about attacking on the flank. Well, here it's a little bit in between, and it's you know, a bit of a judgment call. So at least it's a practical matter. So anyway, nice game, very good attacking play, but still some instructive moments and things to think about for the future. Okay, so this has been a very long show. Hope you'll excuse that, but you know, obviously, I think more players benefit in the long run, so maybe you can watch this in sections. I guess this is not the time for me to say that, because if you've gotten to this point, you've already watched it. Anyway, thanks a lot. Check out my blog when you get a chance. It's at thechessmind.net, thechessmind.net. So it's not the old location. That doesn't exist anymore, but thechessmind.net does. So thank you, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.